the summer of 2024, antique photograph appraiser David Harrison received an intriguing call from the Minnesota Historical Society in St. Paul. The society had recently acquired a collection of early 20th century photographs from a deceased estate, and one particular image had raised questions that required professional analysis. "We have a 1910 family portrait that's connected to one of Minnesota's most puzzling unsolved mysteries," explained Dr. Catherine Nelson, the Society's chief archivist. "The photograph itself appears completely normal, but the story behind it is extraordinary. The entire family disappeared just days after this portrait was taken, and they were never seen again." Harrison, who had spent 25 years investigating photographic mysteries and authentication puzzles, was immediately fascinated. Cold cases involving missing persons from the early 1900s were rare, and the connection to a family portrait added an intriguing dimension to what might have been a routine appraisal. The Minnesota Historical Society occupied an impressive building on Summit Avenue, and Dr. Nelson met Harrison in the Society's climate-controlled research facility where the newly acquired collection was being processed. The room contained dozens of photographs, documents, and personal items that had belonged to various Minnesota families from the early 20th century. "This is the portrait in question," Dr. Nelson said, carefully placing an 8x10-inch photograph on the examination table. "It shows the Henriksen family of Duluth, Minnesota. The photograph was taken on March 15, 1910, at a professional studio in downtown Duluth. 3 days later, on March 18th, the entire family vanished from their home without explanation." The photograph depicted a prosperous-looking family of 5 posed in the formal style typical of professional studio portraiture from 1910. At first glance, everything appeared completely normal, a well-dressed family documenting their prosperity and social standing through professional photography. Harrison examined the mounting and paper quality, confirming that the photograph was genuine and period-appropriate. The image showed no signs of manipulation or unusual circumstances during the photography session itself. Yet Dr. Nelson's revelation about the family's disappearance transformed this ordinary portrait into potential evidence in one of Minnesota's oldest unsolved mysteries. The 1910 photograph showed the Henriksen family in their finest formal attire, positioned according to the established conventions of professional studio portraiture. The composition reflected both the photographer's skill and the family's obvious prosperity, creating an image that conveyed respectability and social success. Lars Henriksen, a distinguished man in his mid-40s, stood behind his seated wife, wearing an impeccably tailored dark suit with vest and gold watch chain. His posture conveyed the confidence of a successful businessman, and his expression reflected the serious demeanor considered appropriate for formal portraits of the period. Astrid Henriksen sat gracefully in an ornate chair, her elaborate dress featuring the intricate beadwork and lace details that indicated substantial wealth. Her hair was arranged in the fashionable pompadour style of 1910, and she wore jewelry that suggested the family's considerable financial success. The couple's 3 children completed the family grouping. 16-year-old Eric stood beside his father wearing a formal suit with high collar that was typical of young men from wealthy families. 14-year-old Ingrid stood near her mother in a dress with sailor-style details, popular for girls of her age. And 10-year-old Magnus sat on a small stool wearing knee breeches and high stockings, characteristic of boys' formal clothing from that era. The studio backdrop featured painted classical elements, marble columns, and garden scenery that created an atmosphere of refinement typical of Minneapolis-St. Paul's premier photography establishments. The photographer had arranged professional lighting to create even illumination across all 5 subjects, demonstrating the technical expertise expected from the region's most established portrait studios. Harrison noted that every element of the photograph appeared authentic and consistent with 1910 American portrait photography. The family's clothing, jewelry, and poses all reflected the prosperity and social aspirations of successful Minnesota families during the period following the state's economic boom in mining and timber industries. Nothing in the portrait itself suggested any unusual circumstances or provided visual clues about what might have led to the family's mysterious disappearance just days after the photograph was taken. Dr. Nelson provided Harrison with detailed documentation about the Henriksen family's mysterious disappearance, which had baffled law enforcement and captivated public attention throughout Minnesota in 1910. The case file revealed circumstances that were both puzzling and deeply unsettling. According to police reports from the Duluth Police Department, the Henriksen family had been reported missing on March 19, 1910, when Lars Henriksen failed to appear for important business meetings and the family's household staff found their residence apparently abandoned. The family's large Victorian home on Superior Street showed no signs of forced entry or struggle. All doors and windows had been properly locked from the inside, and the house appeared to have been left in perfect order. Personal belongings, including valuable jewelry and family heirlooms, remained undisturbed throughout the residence. Most puzzling was the discovery that the family had apparently left voluntarily, but had taken virtually nothing with them. Clothing remained in wardrobes, personal items were still in their usual places, and even daily necessities like toiletries and medications had been left behind. The only items missing from the house were the clothes the family members had apparently been wearing when they left. Police found no evidence that they had packed luggage or prepared for any kind of journey, yet they had somehow departed together without leaving any trace of their destination or intentions. Financial records showed that Lars Henriksen had not withdrawn any significant amounts of money from his bank accounts in the days before the disappearance. His business affairs were in excellent order, with no indication of financial problems or debts that might have motivated the family to flee. The family's domestic staff, a housekeeper and groundskeeper who lived on the property, reported that they had last seen the Henriksens on the evening of March 17th, when the family had appeared completely normal and had given no indication of any plans to travel. The Duluth Police Department had conducted an extensive investigation that included searching the shores of Lake Superior, interviewing business associates and friends, and following up on reported sightings throughout Minnesota and neighboring states. Despite these efforts, no trace of the 5 family members had ever been found. Harrison began his research by examining the broader context of the Henriksen family's life in Duluth during 1910, hoping to identify factors that might have contributed to their mysterious disappearance. He started with business records and newspaper archives to understand Lars Henriksen's professional activities and social connections. Research at the St. Louis County Historical Society revealed that Lars Henriksen had been a prominent figure in Duluth's iron ore shipping industry. He owned several ore boats that transported iron ore from Minnesota's Mesabi Range to steel mills in Ohio and Pennsylvania, a business that had made him wealthy during the height of Minnesota's mining boom. The Duluth News-Tribune archives from early 1910 contained several mentions of Lars Henriksen in business and social contexts. He had been involved in expanding dock facilities at the Port of Duluth and had been planning significant investments in new shipping technology that would increase the efficiency of ore transportation. However, Harrison also discovered newspaper reports from February 1910 that mentioned labor disputes at several ore shipping companies, including concerns about working conditions and safety practices on the Great Lakes cargo vessels. While Lars Henriksen's company was not specifically mentioned in these reports, the disputes had affected the entire industry. More intriguingly, Harrison found a brief mention in the Duluth Herald from early March 1910 about federal investigators who had been conducting inquiries into shipping practices and business relationships among Great Lakes or transportation companies. The article suggested that government officials were examining potential violations of interstate commerce regulations. The timing of these federal investigations, occurring just weeks before the Henriksen family's disappearance, suggested a possible connection that had not been thoroughly explored by local police in 1910. Harrison realized he needed to research federal law enforcement records from that period to understand whether the family's disappearance might have been related to business investigations rather than personal circumstances. He also decided to examine the original police investigation files more carefully, looking for details that might have been overlooked or misinterpreted by investigators who were focused on local rather than federal implications of the case. Harrison's research into federal law enforcement activities in 1910 revealed a complex investigation into Great Lakes shipping practices that had been largely unknown to local authorities in Duluth. Records from the National Archives showed that the Department of Commerce and Labor had been conducting a systematic examination of shipping companies suspected of violating federal regulations. The federal investigation had focused on allegations that several shipping companies were manipulating cargo weights and shipping records to avoid paying proper taxes and tariffs on iron ore transportation. The scheme involved underreporting the actual tonnage of ore being shipped, allowing companies to pay reduced fees while maximizing their profits. More seriously, federal investigators had discovered evidence that some shipping companies were falsifying safety inspection records and operating vessels that did not meet federal safety standards for Great Lakes navigation. These violations had resulted in several accidents and worker injuries that had been covered up through fraudulent reporting. Lars Henriksen's shipping company had been specifically mentioned in federal investigation files as a subject of inquiry. Government investigators had identified discrepancies in his company's cargo reports that suggested systematic underreporting of ore tonnage over several years. The federal records showed that investigators had been planning to interview Lars Henriksen during the week of March 21, 1910, just days after his family's disappearance. The timing suggested that the Henriksens might have learned about the impending federal investigation and had fled to avoid prosecution. However, Harrison also discovered that several other shipping company owners who had been subjects of the federal investigation had remained in Duluth and had eventually negotiated settlements with government authorities. Most had paid fines and agreed to compliance measures without facing criminal prosecution. This raised questions about why Lars Henriksen would have chosen to flee rather than attempting to negotiate a settlement like his business competitors. Harrison realized that the family's disappearance might have been motivated by more serious crimes than simple tax evasion and regulatory violations. He decided to examine the federal investigation files more thoroughly to determine whether Lars Henriksen had been involved in activities that carried more severe legal consequences than the violations that had affected other shipping companies. Harrison's continued research into the federal shipping investigation revealed that Lars Henriksen had been involved in a much more serious criminal conspiracy than simple tax evasion. Confidential federal investigation files showed that his company had been participating in a complex scheme involving international smuggling and illegal immigration. The conspiracy had used ore ships to transport illegal immigrants from Canada into the United States, hiding people in specially constructed compartments within the cargo holds of vessels that appeared to be carrying only iron ore. The operation had been extremely profitable, charging desperate immigrants substantial fees for passage to American industrial cities where they could find work. Federal investigators had also discovered that the smuggling operation was connected to human trafficking, with some immigrants being forced into labor contracts that amounted to indentured servitude. Workers who had been smuggled into the country were threatened with deportation if they attempted to leave their assigned jobs or report unsafe working conditions. Most damaging to Lars Henriksen was evidence that his company had been involved in the trafficking of children and young women, some of whom had been forced into prostitution or domestic servitude after arriving in American cities. This aspect of the operation carried the possibility of federal criminal charges that could have resulted in lengthy prison sentences. The federal investigation files revealed that government agents had been planning to arrest Lars Henriksen and several other shipping company owners during coordinated raids scheduled for March 22, 1910. The arrests were intended to disrupt the entire smuggling network and gather evidence about the scope of the trafficking operation. However, the investigation files also showed that federal agents suspected the smuggling network had been infiltrated by corrupt officials who were providing advance warning about planned arrests. Several previous attempts to apprehend smuggling operation leaders had failed because the targets had disappeared before raids could be conducted. The pattern of suspects fleeing just before federal arrests suggested that Lars Henriksen might have received advance warning about the planned raid on March 22nd. This would explain why the entire family had disappeared so suddenly and completely. On March 18th, giving them several days to escape before federal agents arrived in Duluth. Harrison realized that the Henriksen family's disappearance was likely not a mysterious vanishing, but a carefully planned escape by criminals who knew they were about to be arrested for serious federal crimes. Harrison's investigation into the federal smuggling operation revealed the likely escape route and method that the Henriksen family had used to vanish without a trace. Federal investigation files contained detailed information about the smuggling network's transportation methods and safe house locations that would have been available to Lars Henriksen. The smuggling operation had established a sophisticated system of safe houses and transportation routes that extended from the Canadian border through Minnesota and into major American cities. This network had been designed to move illegal immigrants quickly and discreetly, avoiding detection by federal authorities and local law enforcement. Records showed that the network included safe houses in remote areas of northern Minnesota, where immigrants could be hidden while transportation to final destinations was arranged. These locations were deliberately chosen for their isolation and their distance from major transportation routes that were regularly monitored by authorities. Federal investigators had identified several Great Lakes vessels that were equipped with hidden compartments and secret passages specifically designed for smuggling operations. These ships could transport people to remote locations along the lake shores where they could be transferred to land-based transportation without detection. Most significantly, Harrison discovered that one of Lars Henriksen's ore ships had been reported as departing Duluth Harbor on the evening of March 18, 1910. The same day, the family disappeared. The ship's official cargo manifest indicated it was carrying iron ore to Cleveland, but federal investigators suspected it was actually being used for smuggling operations. The vessel, named the Astrid Marie, after Lars Henriksen's wife, had never arrived at its reported destination in Cleveland. Maritime records showed that the ship had simply vanished from Great Lakes shipping traffic, leading federal investigators to conclude that it had been deliberately sunk or hidden to eliminate evidence of smuggling activities. Harrison realized that the Henriksen family had likely used their own smuggling vessel to escape, possibly traveling to Canada, where they could establish new identities and disappear into immigrant communities that were accustomed to helping people avoid government authorities. The family's complete abandonment of their possessions and their coordinated disappearance suggested that this escape had been planned in advance as a contingency measure in case their criminal activities were discovered by federal investigators. Harrison's research into Canadian immigration records from 1910 revealed evidence suggesting that the Henriksen family had successfully escaped to Canada and had established new identities in immigrant communities where their wealth could help them blend in without attracting attention from authorities. Canadian border records from March 1910 showed several entries of Scandinavian families arriving in remote areas of Ontario and Manitoba, traveling by private boat rather than through official border crossings. While these records did not specifically identify the Henriksens, the timing and method of entry matched the pattern that would have been used by fugitives from the American smuggling investigation. More specifically, Harrison discovered records of a Norwegian family named Larsen that had arrived in Winnipeg, Manitoba in late March 1910 and had immediately purchased a substantial farm property using cash. The family consisted of 2 parents and 3 children whose ages corresponded exactly to the Henriksen family members. The Larsen family had reportedly come from Norway via ship to Montreal, but Canadian immigration officials had noted discrepancies in their documentation that suggested the papers might have been falsified. However, because the family had substantial financial resources and was planning to establish agricultural operations, officials had not investigated the irregularities. What made the Larsen family particularly interesting was their immediate integration into Winnipeg's Scandinavian immigrant community, where they had quickly established connections with other Norwegian and Swedish families who were building new lives in Canada. Within months of their arrival, they had become prominent members of the local Lutheran church and had invested in several business ventures. Harrison also discovered that the Larsen family had been particularly generous in providing financial assistance to newly arrived immigrants who needed help establishing themselves in Canada. This pattern of helping other immigrants was consistent with people who understood the challenges of starting over in a new country with hidden identities. Most tellingly, records showed that the Larsen family had maintained their prosperity in Canada for several years before eventually disappearing again around 1915. Local newspaper accounts from Winnipeg mentioned that the family had sold their farm and business interests and had moved to relatives in the United States, never to return to Manitoba. Harrison's investigation revealed that the family's second disappearance from Canada in 1915 had been prompted by increasing international law enforcement cooperation that threatened to expose their hidden identities. The outbreak of World War I had led to enhanced scrutiny of immigrant communities and increased information sharing between American and Canadian authorities. Federal investigation files from 1915 showed that American authorities had been working with Canadian officials to locate fugitives from pre-war criminal investigations, including the Great Lakes smuggling operation that had involved Lars Henriksen. The cooperation had included sharing photographs and descriptions of wanted criminals with Canadian law enforcement agencies. The timing of the Larson family's departure from Winnipeg coincided with these enhanced law enforcement efforts, suggesting that they had learned about the increased risk of discovery and had once again fled to avoid arrest and extradition to the United States. Canadian Pacific Railway records from 1915 showed tickets purchased by the Larson family for travel to Vancouver, British Columbia, where they could potentially arrange transportation to more distant locations. The railway tickets had been purchased with cash and had specified travel under assumed names, indicating continued efforts to conceal their true identities. From Vancouver, Harrison discovered evidence suggesting that the family had arranged passage on ships traveling to various international destinations, where they could establish new lives beyond the reach of American or Canadian law enforcement. Shipping records from 1915 showed several vessels departing Vancouver for Australia, South America, and Asia that could have provided opportunities for permanent relocation. The family's pattern of maintaining their wealth and prosperity despite multiple relocations suggested that Lars Henriksen had successfully transferred significant financial resources out of the United States before their initial escape in 1910. This advanced planning had enabled them to establish comfortable lives wherever they relocated while maintaining the resources necessary to disappear again when circumstances required. Harrison realized that the Henriksen family's disappearance had not been a mysterious vanishing, but rather the beginning of a new life as international fugitives who had successfully evaded justice for crimes that had exploited vulnerable immigrants and contributed to human trafficking operations. Harrison's investigation concluded with the recognition that the Henriksen family had successfully escaped justice for serious federal crimes and had likely lived comfortable lives under assumed identities for decades after their 1910 disappearance from Duluth. The case represented a failure of early 20th century law enforcement to effectively pursue international fugitives. Federal investigation files from the 1920s showed that American authorities had eventually given up active pursuit of Lars Henriksen and his family, concluding that they had either died during their escape attempt or had successfully established themselves in countries where extradition would be impossible. The broader smuggling investigation had resulted in the arrest and prosecution of several other shipping company owners and their associates. But the Henriksen family's escape had eliminated a key source of evidence about the scope and organization of the trafficking operation. Their disappearance had also allowed other participants in the conspiracy to avoid prosecution by claiming that Lars Henriksen had been the primary organizer of the illegal activities. Most significantly, Harrison discovered that the Henriksen family's successful escape had inspired other criminals to develop similar contingency plans for avoiding federal prosecution. The case had demonstrated that wealthy criminals with international connections could disappear completely if they were willing to abandon their official identities and established lives. The 1910 family portrait, taken just days before their disappearance, represented the last documented evidence of the Henriksens' existence under their real names. The photograph had captured a family that appeared prosperous and respectable, providing no visual indication of their involvement in human trafficking and international smuggling operations. As Harrison prepared his final report for the Minnesota Historical Society, he reflected on how the seemingly ordinary family portrait had documented the final moments of criminals who had successfully evaded justice for over a century. The case demonstrated how early 20th century limitations in international law enforcement had allowed serious criminals to escape consequences for crimes that had exploited vulnerable people seeking better lives in America. The Henriksen family's disappearance remained officially unsolved, but Harrison's investigation had revealed that it was actually a successful criminal escape that had been carefully planned and expertly executed by people who understood that their wealth and international connections could provide freedom from American justice if they were willing to sacrifice their identities and social standing. The portrait served as a reminder that appearances could be deeply deceiving, and that even the most respectable-looking families might be hiding involvement in serious criminal activities that affected the lives of countless vulnerable people.